2. The disappearance of the individual subject, along with its formal consequence, the increasing unavailability of the personal style, engender the well-nigh universal practice today of what may be called pastiche. This concept, which we owe to Thomas Mann in Dr. Faustus, who owed it in turn to Adorno's great work on the two paths of advanced musical experimentation, Schönberg's innovative planification, and Stravinsky's irrational eclecticism, is to be sharply distinguished from the more readily received idea of parody. To be sure, parody found a fertile area in the idiosyncrasies of the moderns and their inimitable styles. The Faulknerian long sentence, for example, with its breathless gerundives, Laurentian nature imagery punctuated by testy colloquialism, Wallace Stevens' inveterate hypostasis of non-substantive parts of speech, the intricate evasions of as, the fateful but finally predictable swoops in Mahler from high orchestral pathos into village accordion sentiment, Heidegger's meditative solemn practice of the false etymology as a mode of proof. All these strike one as somehow characteristic, insofar as they ostentatiously deviate from a norm which then reasserts itself in a not necessarily unfriendly way, by a systematic mimicry of their willful eccentricities. Yet in the dialectical leap from quantity to quality, the explosion of modern literature into a host of distinct private styles and mannerisms has been followed by a linguistic fragmentation of social life itself, to the point where the norm itself is eclipsed, reduced to a neutral and reified media speech, far enough from the utopian aspirations of the inventors of Esperanto or Basic English, which itself then becomes but one more idiolect among many. Modernist styles thereby become postmodernist codes, and that the stupendous proliferation of social codes today into professional and disciplinary jargons, but also into the badges of affirmation of ethnic, gender, race, religious, and class factional adhesion, is also a political phenomenon. The problem of micropolitics sufficiently demonstrates. If the ideas of a ruling class were once the dominant or hegemonic ideology of bourgeois society, the advanced capitalist countries today are now a field of stylistic and discursive heterogeneity without a norm. Faceless masters continue to inflect the economic strategies which constrain our existences, but they no longer need to impose their speech, or are henceforth unable to. And the post-literacy of the late capitalist world reflects not only the absence of any great collective project, but also the unavailability of the older national language itself. In this situation, parody finds itself without a vocation. It has lived, and that strange new thing, pastiche, slowly comes to take its place. Pastiche is, like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique idiosyncratic style, the wearing of a linguistic mask, speech in a dead language. But it is a neutral practice of such mimicry, without any of parody's ulterior motives, amputated of the satiric impulse, devoid of laughter and of any conviction that alongside the abnormal tongue you have momentarily borrowed, some healthy linguistic normality still exists. Pastiche is thus blank parody, a statue with blind eyeballs. It is to parody what that other interesting and historically original modern thing, the practice of a kind of blank irony, is to what Wayne Booth calls the stable ironies of the 18th century. It would therefore begin to seem that Adorno's prophetic diagnosis has been realized, albeit in a negative way. Not Schönberg, the sterility of whose achieved system he already glimpsed, but Stravinsky is the true precursor of postmodern cultural production. For with the collapse of the high modernist ideology of style, what is as unique and unmistakable as your own fingerprints, as incomparable as your own body, the very source, for an early Roland Barthes, of stylistic invention and innovation, the producers of culture have nowhere to turn but to the past, the imitation of dead styles, speech, through all the masks and voices stored up in the imaginary museum of a now global culture. This situation evidently determines what the architecture historians call historicism, namely, the random cannibalization of all the styles of the past, the play of random stylistic illusion, and in general what Henri Lefebvre has called the increasing primacy of the neo. This omnipresence of pastiche is not incompatible with a certain humour, however, nor is it innocent of all passion. It is, at the least, compatible with addiction, with a whole historically original consumer's appetite for a world transformed into sheer images of itself, and for pseudo-events and spectacles, the term of the situationists. It is for such objects that we may reserve Plato's conception of the simulacrum, the identical copy for which no original has ever existed. Appropriately enough, the culture of the simulacrum comes to life in a society where exchange value has been generalized to the point at which the very memory of use value is effaced, a society of which Debord has observed, in an extraordinary phrase, that in it the image has become the final form of commodity reification, the society of the spectacle. The new spatial logic of the simulacrum can now be expected to have a momentous effect on what used to be historical time. The past is thereby itself modified. What was once, in the historical novel, as Lukács defines it, the organic genealogy of the bourgeois collective project, what is still, for the redemptive historiography of an E.P. Thompson or of American oral history, for the resurrection of the dead of anonymous and silent generations, the retrospective dimension indispensable to any vital reorientation of our collective future, has meanwhile itself become a vast collection of images, a multitudinous photographic simulacrum. Guy Debord's powerful slogan is now even more apt for the prehistory of a society bereft of all historicity, one whose own putative past is little more than a set of dusty spectacles. In faithful conformity to post-structuralist linguistic theory, the past as referent finds itself gradually bracketed and then effaced altogether, leaving us with nothing but texts. Yet it should not be thought that this process is accompanied by indifference. On the contrary, the remarkable current intensification of an addiction to the photographic image is itself a tangible symptom of an omnipresent, omnivorous, and well-nigh libidinal historicism. As I have already observed, the architects use this exceedingly polysemous word for the complacent eclecticism of postmodern architecture, which randomly and without principle, but with gusto, cannibalizes all the architectural styles of the past and combines them in overstimulating ensembles. Nostalgia does not strike one as an altogether satisfactory word for such fascination, particularly when one thinks of the pain of a properly modernist nostalgia, with a past beyond all but aesthetic retrieval. Yet it directs our attention to what is a culturally far more generalized manifestation of the process in commercial art and taste, namely the so-called nostalgia film, or what the French call la mode rétro. Nostalgia films restructure the whole issue of pastiche and project it onto a collective and social level, where the desperate attempt to appropriate a missing past is now refracted through the iron law of fashion change and the emergent ideology of the generation. The inaugural film of this new aesthetic discourse, George Lucas's American Graffiti, 1973, set out to recapture, as so many films have attempted since, the henceforth mesmerizing lost reality of the Eisenhower era. And one tends to feel that, for Americans at least, the 1950s remain the privileged lost object of desire, not merely the stability and prosperity of a Pax Americana, but also the first naive innocence of the countercultural impulses of early rock and roll and youth gangs. Coppola's Rumblefish will then be the contemporary dirge that laments their passing, itself, however, still contradictorily filmed in genuine nostalgia film style. With this initial breakthrough, other generational periods open up for aesthetic colonization, as witnessed the stylistic recuperation of the American and the Italian 1930s in Polanski's Chinatown and Bertolucci's Il Conformista, respectively. More interesting and more problematical are the ultimate attempts through this new discourse to lay siege either to our own present and immediate past or to a more distant history that escapes individual existential memory. Faced with these ultimate objects, our social, historical, and existential present, and the past as referent, the incompatibility of a postmodernist nostalgia art language with genuine historicity becomes dramatically apparent. The contradiction propels this mode, however, into complex and interesting new formal inventiveness, it being understood that the nostalgia film was never a matter of some old-fashioned representation of historical content, but instead approached the past through stylistic connotation, conveying pastness by the glossy qualities of the image, and 1930s-ness or 1950s-ness by the attributes of fashion, in that following the prescription of the Barthes of mythologies, who saw connotation as the purveying of imaginary and stereotypical idealities. Cinité, for example, as some Disney Epcot concept of China. The insensible colonization of the present by the nostalgia mode can be observed in Lawrence Kasdan's elegant film Body Heat, a distant, affluent society remake of James M. Cain's Double Indemnity, set in a contemporary Florida small town a few hours' drive from Miami. The word remake is, however, anachronistic to the degree to which our awareness of the pre-existence of other versions, previous films of the novel as well as the novel itself, is now a constitutive and essential part of the film structure. We are now, in other words, in intertextuality, as a deliberate built-in feature of the aesthetic effect, and as the operator of a new connotation of pastness and pseudo-historical depth, in which the history of aesthetic styles displaces real history. Yet from the outset, a whole battery of aesthetic signs begin to distance the officially contemporary image from us in time. The Art Deco scripting of the credits, for example, serves at once to program the spectator to the appropriate nostalgia mode of reception. Art Deco quotation has much the same function in contemporary architecture as in Toronto's remarkable Eaton Centre. Meanwhile, a somewhat different play of connotations is activated by complex but purely formal allusions to the institution of the star system itself. The protagonist, William Hurt, is one of a new generation of film stars whose status is markedly distinct from that of the preceding generation of male superstars, such as Steve McQueen or Jack Nicholson, or even more distantly Brando, let alone of earlier moments in the evolution of the institution of the star. The immediately preceding generation projected their various roles through and by way of their well-known off-screen personalities, which often connoted rebellion and nonconformism. The latest generation of starring actors continues to assure the conventional functions of stardom, most notably sexuality, but in the utter absence of personality in the older sense, and with something of the anonymity of character acting, which in actors like Hurt reaches virtuoso proportions, yet of a very different kind than the virtuosity of the older Brando or Olivier. This death of the subject in the institution of the star now, however, opens up the possibility of a play of historical allusions to much older roles, in this case to those associated with Clark Gable, so that the very style of the acting can now also serve as a connotator of the past. Finally, the setting has been strategically framed, with great ingenuity, to eschew most of the signals that normally convey the contemporaneity of the United States in its multinational era. The small-town setting allows the camera to elude the high-rise landscape of the 1970s and 1980s, even though a key episode in the narrative involves the fatal destruction of older buildings by land speculators, while the object world of the present day, artifacts and appliances, whose styling would at once serve to date the image, is elaborately edited out. Everything in the film, therefore, conspires to blur its official contemporaneity and make it possible for the viewer to receive the narrative as though it was set in some eternal 30s beyond real historical time. This approach to the present, by way of the art language of the simulacrum, or of the pastiche of the stereotypical past, endows present reality and the openness of present history with the spell and distance of a glossy mirage. Yet this mesmerizing new aesthetic mode itself emerged as an elaborated symptom of the waning of our historicity, of our lived possibility of experiencing history in some active way. It cannot therefore be said to produce this strange occultation of the present by its own formal power, but rather merely to demonstrate, through these inner contradictions, the enormity of a situation in which we seem increasingly incapable of fashioning representations of our own current experience. As for real history itself, the traditional object, however it may be defined, or what used to be the historical novel, It will be more revealing now to turn back to that older form and medium and to read its postmodern fate in the work of one of the few serious and innovative leftist novelists at work in the United States today, whose books are nourished with history in the more traditional sense and seem, so far, to stake out successive generational moments in the epic of American history between which they alternate. E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime gives itself officially as a panorama of the first 2 decades of the century, like World's Fair. His most recent novel, Billy Bathgate, like Loon Lake, addresses the 30s and the Great Depression, while The Book of Daniel holds up before us, in painful juxtaposition, the 2 great moments of the old left and the new left, of 30s and 40s communism, and the radicalism of the 1960s. Even his early Western may be said to fit into this scheme and to designate in a less articulated and formally self-conscious way the end of the frontier of the late 19th century. The Book of Daniel is not the only one of these 5 major historical novels to establish an explicit narrative link between the readers and the writers present and the older historical reality that is the subject of the work. The astonishing last page of Loon Lake, which I will not disclose, also does this in a very different way. It is a matter of some interest to note that the first version of Ragtime positions us explicitly in our own present, in the novelist's house in New Rochelle, New York, which at once becomes the scene of its own imaginary past in the 1900s. This detail has been suppressed from the published text, symbolically cutting its moorings and freeing the novel to float in some new world of past historical time, whose relationship to us is problematical indeed. The authenticity of the gesture, however, may be measured by the evident existential fact of life that there no longer does seem to be any organic relationship between the American history we learn from schoolbooks and the lived experience of the current multinational, high-rise, stagflated city of the newspapers and of our everyday life. A crisis in historicity, however, inscribes itself symptomatically in several other curious formal features within this text. Its official subject is the transition from a pre-World War I radical and working-class politics, the Great Strikes, to the technological invention and new commodity production of the 1920s, the rise of Hollywood and of the image as commodity. The interpolated version of Kleist's Michael Kohlhaas, the strange, tragic episode of the black protagonist's revolt, may be thought of as a moment related to this process. That Ragtime has political content and even something like a political meaning seems in any case obvious, and has been expertly articulated by Linda Hutcheon in terms of, quote, its 3 paralleled families, the Anglo-American establishment one, and the marginal immigrant European and American black ones. The novel's action disperses the center of the first and moves the margins into the multiple centers of the narrative, in a formal allegory of the social demographics of urban America. In addition, there is an extended critique of American democratic ideals through the presentation of class conflict rooted in capitalist property and moneyed power. The black Kohlhaas, the white Houdini, the immigrant Tate are all working class, and because of this, not in spite of it, all can therefore work to create new aesthetic forms, ragtime, vaudeville, movies. End quote. But this does everything but the essential, lending the novel an admirable thematic coherence few readers can have experienced in parsing the lines of a verbal object held too close to the eyes to fall into these perspectives. Hutcheon is, of course, absolutely right, and this is what the novel would have meant had it not been a postmodern artifact. For one thing, the objects of representation, ostensibly narrative characters, are incommensurable and, as it were, of incomparable substances, like oil and water, Houdini being a historical figure, Tate a fictional one, and Kohlhaas an intertextual one, something very different for an interpretive comparison of this kind to register. Meanwhile, the theme attributed to the novel also demands a somewhat different kind of scrutiny, since it can be rephrased into a classic version of the left's experience of defeat in the 20th century, namely, the proposition that the depoliticization of the workers' movement is attributable to the media or culture generally, what she here calls new aesthetic forms. This is, indeed, in my opinion, something like the elegiac backdrop, if not the meaning, of Ragtime, and perhaps of Doctorow's work in general. But then we need another way of describing the novel as something like an unconscious expression and associative exploration of this left doxa, this historical opinion or quasi-vision in the mind's eye of objective spirit. What such a description would want to register is the paradox that a seemingly realistic novel like Ragtime is in reality a non-representational work that combines fantasy signifiers from a variety of ideologemes in a kind of hologram. My point, however, is not some hypothesis as to the thematic coherence of this decentered narrative, but rather just the opposite, namely, the way in which the kind of reading this novel imposes makes it virtually impossible for us to reach and thematize those official subjects, which float above the text, but cannot be integrated into our reading of the sentences. In that sense, the novel not only resists interpretation, it is organized systematically and formally to short-circuit an older type of social and historical interpretation, which it perpetually holds out and withdraws. When we remember that the theoretical critique and repudiation of interpretation as such is a fundamental component of post-structuralist theory, it is difficult not to conclude that Doctorow has somehow deliberately built this very tension, this very contradiction, into the flow of his sentences. The book is crowded with real historical figures, from Teddy Roosevelt to Emma Goldman, from Harry K. Thorne and Stanford White to J. Pierpont Morgan and Henry Ford, not to mention the more central role of Houdini, who interact with a fictive family, simply designated as father, mother, older brother, and so forth. All historical novels, beginning with those of Sir Walter Scott himself, no doubt in one way or another involve a mobilization of previous historical knowledge, generally acquired through the schoolbook history manuals devised for whatever legitimizing purpose by this or that national tradition, thereafter instituting a narrative dialectic between what we already know about the pretender, say, and what he is then seen to be concretely in the pages of the novel. But Doctorow's procedure seems much more extreme than this, and I would argue that the designation of both types of characters, historical names and capitalized family roles, operates powerfully and systematically to reify all these characters and to make it impossible for us to receive their representation without the prior interception of already acquired knowledge or doxa, something which lends the text an extraordinary sense of déjà vu and a peculiar familiarity one is tempted to associate with Freud's Return of the Repressed in the uncanny, rather than with any solid historiographic formation on the reader's part. Meanwhile, the sentences in which all this is happening have their own specificity, allowing us more concretely to distinguish the modern's elaboration of a personal style from this new kind of linguistic innovation, which is no longer personal at all, but has its family kinship rather with what Barthes long ago called white writing. In this particular novel, Doctorow has imposed upon himself a rigorous principle of selection in which only simple declarative sentences, predominantly mobilized by the verb to be, are received. The effect is, however, not really one of the condescending simplification and symbolic carefulness of children's literature, but rather something more disturbing, the sense of some profound subterranean violence done to American English, which cannot, however, be detected empirically in any of the perfectly grammatical sentences with which this work is formed. Yet other more visible technical innovations may supply a clue to what is happening in the language of ragtime. It is, for example, well known that the source of many of the characteristic effects of Camus' novel, The Stranger, can be traced back to that author's willful decision to substitute, throughout, the French tense of the passé composé for the other past tenses more normally employed in narration in that language. I suggest that it is as if something of that sort were at work here, as though Doctorow had set out systematically to produce the effect, or the equivalent, in his language, of a verbal past tense we do not possess in English, namely the French preterite, or passé simple, whose perfective movement, as Émile Benveniste taught us, serves to separate events from the present of enunciation and to transform the stream of time and action into so many finished, complete, and isolated punctual event objects which find themselves sundered from any present situation, even that of the act of storytelling or enunciation. E.L. Doctorow is the epic poet of the disappearance of the American radical past, of the suppression of older traditions and moments of the American radical tradition. No one with left sympathies can read these splendid novels without a poignant distress that is an authentic way of confronting our own current political dilemmas in the present. What is culturally interesting, however, is that he has had to convey this great theme formally, since the waning of the content is very precisely his subject, and, more than that, has had to elaborate his work by way of that very cultural logic of the postmodern, which is itself the mark and symptom of his dilemma. Loon Lake, much more obviously, deploys the strategies of the pastiche, most notably in its reinvention of Dos Passos, but Ragtime remains the most peculiar and stunning monument to the aesthetic situation engendered by the disappearance of the historical referent. This historical novel can no longer set out to represent the historical past. It can only represent our ideas and stereotypes about that past, which thereby at once becomes pop history. Cultural production is thereby driven back inside a mental space which is no longer that of the old monadic subject, but rather that of some degraded collective objective spirit. It can no longer gaze directly on some putative real world, at some reconstruction of a past history which was once itself a present. Rather, as in Plato's cave, it must trace our mental images of that past upon its confining walls. If there is any realism left here, it is a realism that is meant to derive from the shock of grasping that confinement and of slowly becoming aware of a new and original historical situation in which we are condemned to seek history by way of our own pop images and simulacra of that history, which itself remains forever out of reach.